Tonight at 10, President Biden issues a warning to Russia that any incursion into Ukraine would be an unacceptable invasion. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians prepare to fight as 100,000 Russian troops mass on its border.
There is no doubt, let there be no doubt at all, that if Putin makes this choice, Russia will pay a heavy price.
British military personnel have arrived in Ukraine to help train local forces. We'll have the very latest, also tonight. Boris Johnson says he's seen no proof of blackmail in his party after claims of strong-arm tactics to help prevent a leadership challenge.
I've seen no evidence, heard no evidence to support any of those allegations.
Children in England no longer have to wear face coverings in class, but head teachers say it's too soon. The aftermath of the tsunami that hit Tonga, aid planes finally arrive in the South Pacific. And the blisters that helped sink the hopes of Britain's Emma Raducanu in the Australian Open.
And coming up in the sport on the BBC News Channel, we'll tell you who's through to the League Cup final after Arsenal and Liverpool go head-to-head at the Emirates.
Good evening. President Biden has offered his full backing to Ukraine, saying any incursion by Russian forces massed on its border would constitute an unacceptable invasion. He says there would be a severe and coordinated economic response from the West, and that retaliation has been laid out very clearly for President Putin. The comments come on the eve of fresh talks in Geneva between the US and Russia to try to reduce tensions. Meanwhile, the first members of a 30-strong British military team have arrived in Ukraine to help train local forces in the use of anti-tank weapons. Boris Johnson says any Russian incursion would be a disaster for both countries and the world. Our diplomatic correspondent James Landale has the latest from Geneva.
It's not just the Russians who are conducting military exercises. These are pictures released by Ukraine's defence ministry, showing their forces training close to Crimea, that was annexed by Russia in 2014, in the kind of incursion that Ukraine and its allies are trying to deter once again.
I've been absolutely clear with President Putin. He has no misunderstanding. If any assembled Russian units move across the Ukrainian border, that is an invasion. But it will be met with severe and coordinated economic response.
In some of the most intensive American diplomacy for years, the US Secretary of State has been touring Western capitals. He was in Berlin today, rallying support for Ukraine and appealing directly to the people of Russia.
You deserve to live with security and dignity. But what really risks your security is a pointless war with your neighbors in Ukraine.
Western allies are threatening Russia with massive economic sanctions if there's any invasion. Behind the scenes, there are differences over what those penalties should be, but the public message is united.
We are in absolutely close coordination with regard to joint sanctions because we have an absolutely joint assessment of the situation, but also of the reactions with regard to the security of Ukraine. This also applies to sanctions.
Fresh satellite images appear to show how Russia has massed not just troops near Ukraine, but also military equipment. From Klimovo to the north, to Soloti on Ukraine's eastern border, and Novozhnoye to the south near Crimea. The diplomacy now moves to Geneva, where Mr. Blinken arrived for talks with his Russian counterpart on Friday.
But the discussions at this hotel tomorrow may be difficult because the gap between both sides is so large. The Americans want to talk about avoiding war in Ukraine, but the Russians want to talk about their demands for NATO to step back and allow Moscow to establish a new sphere of influence across Eastern Europe.
In eastern Ukraine, they know what that might mean. Pro-Russian separatists have been fighting government forces here since 2014, and the scars are all to see. Antonina Zaitseva is 72 years old and lives close to the front line. It's a miracle we stayed alive, she says. We could have died many times. She's pro-Russian and fears a full-scale war. Russia denies that is its intention. but its forces are training hard, close to Ukraine. The question now is whether all these exercises might soon become the real thing.
Well, James, what hope of a breakthrough in tomorrow's talks between the US and Russia where you are?
Well, Clive, I don't think there's any great hope of some grand breakthrough tomorrow. The gap between both sides remains large. No new proposal is being held together by an awful lot of diplomacy on all sides. Boris Johnson spoke to his German counterpart this evening, just as British forces, a small group, were arriving in Ukraine to help train with some new anti-tank missiles that the UK has delivered. And that said, there's also this point. The fact that these talks are taking place tomorrow has raised some eyebrows and has been seen by some as a good sign. They've been thrown together at the last minute. They were only agreed a couple of days ago. Last week, many people were saying the diplomatic route is over. Well, not quite. And I think the hope is that tomorrow, Antony Blinken and his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov haven't met for some time, but since well before Christmas. They've got a lot to talk about. And the hope is that while the talking continues, at least the prospect is, the hope is that maybe the fighting is a little bit more distant.
OK, James, thank you. James Landell there, live in Geneva. Boris Johnson says he hasn't seen any evidence to back up claims from a senior Conservative MP that the government has attempted to blackmail colleagues who are opposing him. William Wragg, who's one of those calling for the Prime Minister to resign over lockdown parties at Downing Street, says rebels had faced pressures and intimidation. All eyes will soon be on the report into lockdown parties by the senior civil servant Sue Gray. Here's our political editor, Laura Koonsberg.
If it's not one thing but turns out to be another.
How will it turn out?
For
For weeks, the Prime Minister has been having to explain himself.
So what's this?
And what happened in number 10 during the pandemic made some of the public and his own MPs mad. But there are claims now too. His team have been intimidating Tory backbenchers who want to speak out.
I've seen no evidence, heard no evidence to support any of those allegations. And what I'm focused on is what we're doing.
MPs being subject to some pretty strong persuasion. In dark corners, around the corridors of power, party bosses work to keep backbenchers in line. But in front of the cameras this morning, a Tory critic of Boris Johnson said it's gone far too far.
Of confidence in the party leadership of the Prime Minister. The reports of which I'm aware would seem to constitute blackmail.
The claims have raised eyebrows.
William Wragg's warning is probably timely, and I would very much hope that it will be heeded.
In both ways.
It's complete nonsense, it's attention-seeking behaviour, and it's disappointing.
Businesses. This brand new Labour MP, a defector,
the Labour MP from Bury South, Christian Wakeford,
says when he was still a Tory, he was warned his constituency would lose out if he didn't vote a certain way.
I was threatened that I would not get the score for Radcliffe if I didn't vote one particular way. How do you feel when holding back a regeneration of a town for a vote? It didn't sit comfortably, and that was really that kind of starting to question my place where I was.
Politics is not for the faint-hearted. Conversations behind closed doors can be brutal. But what today's argument shows is the boiling tension inside the Conservative Party, fighting while everyone awaits the official verdict into what really happened in number 10 during lockdown. But one conclusion is perhaps already being drawn. A member of the Cabinet publicly admitting today that this saga is damaging our democracy. And the doubts about Boris Johnson's leadership run deep.
If this particular episode passes, there are still big changes that need to happen. Downing Street is not being run in the way that most of us would like to see. I think there needs to be a change in both the culture and the structure of Downing Street.
Much may stand between Boris Johnson and any exit, yet with a bright light shone on his government's conduct and character, the omens do not look good. Laura Koonsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Some of England's Plan B measures to tackle the spread of coronavirus have now been scrapped. The work-from-home advisory has ended and secondary school pupils are no longer required to wear face coverings in class. And from next Thursday, no more compulsory face masks in most settings and COVID passes for large venues will be dropped. But there is concern that the moves could lead to increased pressure on the NHS, already under strain due to long waiting lists. With more, here's our health correspondent Dominic Hughes.
How many discharges have we got today? I'm thinking 4 on this list.
At the Royal Bolton Hospital, clinical staff, nurses and therapists are working with the local council to try and get patients back home.
Any issues? No? Okay.
One reason hospitals are so busy is that some patients face significant delays in getting home, even if they're well enough to leave. And it's a complicated process.
There's so many services involved in one patient. There's equipment, there's package of care, there's access issues, there's family, there's transport. So we need to make medicines are ready for home. So we need to make sure everybody's on the same page and we're aiming for that discharge.
NHS England says 93% of all hospital beds are currently occupied. And the impact of COVID on staff and patients makes things even more complex.
We've been hit by workforce shortages for the last few months now. The Omicron wave has obviously affected that as well. We've also had to work really closely with our care homes. So our care homes have been managing outbreaks with their staff, unfortunately some with residents as well, and that has affected their ability to take people directly from hospital.
Even though the number of COVID infections is falling across the UK, hospitals remain under significant pressure. And those pressures can be seen right across the system, from accident and emergency departments to the amount of time people are having to wait for a cancer referral. Today, Wales has seen a record backlog of patients waiting for routine hospital treatment, more than 680,000 people. And NHS leaders in England say the months to come could be tough. But at the same time, as COVID restrictions in England are eased, the Health Secretary declared victory over the Omicron variant.
And today really is a new chapter in our fight against COVID-19 as we return to Plan A. And we said when we learned about Omicron, we needed to build the defences and we needed to buy time to do that. That was the purpose of Plan B. And if you look at the data now, it is in retreat.
Tens of thousands of office staff in England have already been encouraged to return to work. Next week we'll see the end of mandatory face coverings and COVID passes, as well as the return of nightclubs and large indoor events in Scotland, the relaxing of rules for hospitality in Northern Ireland, and a gradual easing of restrictions in Wales. But in some parts of the UK, particularly the north of England, infections are still very high, and health officials are concerned the relaxing of rules has come too soon.
Enabling full mixing without any mitigations such as wearing masks or social distancing will mean that there will be, sort of preventable transmission. It would have been slightly better that we'd got our case rates lower before we started to relax completely.
The health service remains under pressure, but the immediate threat of Omicron seems to be receding. Ministers have made a judgment call. The costs of restrictions now outweigh the benefits. Dominic Hughes, BBC News, Bolton.
Well, the government's latest figures show the number of people testing positive for coronavirus is continuing to fall, with just over 107,300 new infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period. That means, on average, just under 93,000 new cases were reported per day in the last week. The number of people in hospital with COVID has fallen again to just under 18,500. There were 330 deaths reported in the latest 24-hour period. That's of people who died within 28 days of a positive test, though some may have died for reasons other than COVID. On average, in the past week, 266 deaths were announced every day. On vaccinations, just under 36,700,000 people have now had a booster jab, which means nearly 64% of those aged 12 and over have now had 3 doses. Well, as we've heard, children in England no longer have to wear face coverings during lessons, and from next Thursday they won't have to wear them at all in any enclosed space. But some secondary school head teachers have criticised the move. They say they'll continue to tell students to keep masks on until it's certain COVID infection rates are falling. Here's our education correspondent, Elaine Dunkley.
Shirt,
At Chesterfield-Hine-Crosby, there's a change in the school rules.
Yeah, English next.
Across England, pupils no longer have to wear masks in class.
It steams up your glasses. I keep on having to take my glasses off if I'm wearing my mask. Every time you look down and writing, your mask just falls down and then you have to think, oh, I've got to put it back on my nose, and it just distracts you.
Morning, everybody.
This head says it's another announcement from the government at short notice.
Personally, I would have carried on wearing masks in classrooms till the half term and then actually retested everyone after half term, and then at that point you could have actually started to move into spring not wearing masks.
Face coverings are still needed in communal areas.
Girls, have you got masks?
From next week, they'll no longer be required in schools in England. For this maths teacher,
I have 5 classes of 30. They're all different contacts, they're all different households.
the risks haven't gone away.
I know how useful it can be to have any mitigation that we can to allow pupils to stay in classrooms as much as possible and to allow teachers to be in classrooms.
The original expression was all intent of X.
The government says the decision to remove masks in class is in response to a fall in the number of COVID cases.
Second week back in, somebody tested positive, so our year went off.
These sixth formers are about to sit their A-levels and don't want to take any chances.
So when we were supposed to be sitting our GCSEs, obviously they got cancelled. How am I going to do in these exams? Because it's like I've never done them before. I have like a proper exam, especially because the A-levels. You really need to do well because you've got uni offers to get.
In my family, we've recently just had COVID. I don't want to miss any more school with exams coming up, so my face mask's going to stay on.
Ready, go!
In Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, the guidance is still to wear masks at all times. Removing masks in classes in England may feel like a milestone.
Where's your mask?
But for those in education, it doesn't take away the disruption many schools are still facing.
Come on, girls, let's go.
Elaine Dunkley, BBC News in Crosby.
The first plane loads of aid have arrived at Tonga's main airport after last Saturday's underwater volcanic eruption and tsunami cut the Pacific island nation off from the outside world. More flights and several ships are on their way, bringing urgently needed drinking water, food and medicines. The Queen says her thoughts and prayers are with the people of Tonga, which is part of the Commonwealth. Here's Rupert Wingfield-Hayes.
For the first time since last Saturday's huge eruption, we're finally getting to see what has happened to Tonga's main island. Along the coast, the damage from the tsunami looks extensive, with many buildings destroyed. In Tonga's capital, Nuku'alofa, there's a lot of volcanic ash, but the buildings are intact and the cleanup has begun. Telephone services are also back, and that means for Tongans living abroad, the agonising wait for news is finally over.
It's a relief to finally hear their voices and to finally know how they are back home. My dad had told me that, they're fine, no major damages to our homes.
So at the moment, I've got family over in the outer islands of Ha'apai. I have heard from them and they're doing okay. Who I haven't heard from is my father. I'm sure he's out there working hard, doing what he does.
We've also learned of a remarkable survival story. This man says he was swept off a small island by the tsunami and was in the water for more than 24 hours before making it to land. Help is now arriving. This is an Australian C-17 transport plane on final approach to Tonga this afternoon. The crew quickly unloaded water and emergency supplies, but because of COVID, they were not allowed any contact with locals. Tonga's government has decided that until the COVID pandemic is over, the islanders will have to deal with the clean-up from this disaster by themselves. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific in Peru, another clean-up is underway. The crude oil on these beaches was spilled from a tanker that was unloading when a tsunami hit the coast here, triggered by the eruption in Tonga, more than 10,000 kilometres away. Rupert Wingfield-Hayes, BBC News in Tokyo.
The government has refused permission for a new electricity link beneath the channel, bringing energy from France. The company involved, Aquind, is part-owned by two men who've made large donations to the Conservative Party. The proposal involved laying cables from Portsmouth to Normandy at a cost of over £1 billion. But the Business Secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, says he isn't satisfied more appropriate alternatives have been fully considered. And there are still more than 1,000 high-rise tower blocks across Britain with flammable cladding. New government figures show that 40% of the buildings that have exactly the same type as that found on Grenfell Tower have still to be made safe. And there are many hundreds more with other types of dangerous cladding that also need to be fixed. The Community Secretary Michael Gove has been holding talks with some of Britain's biggest developers, urging them to pay billions to help leaseholders. Sarah Corker has been speaking to some of those caught up in the cladding crisis.
Hi, I'm Ellie.
My name is Stephen.
I'm Tamaya.
My name's Will. I'm a leaseholder of a flat in Sheffield.
No work has started and no funding has been confirmed
due to ongoing delays with the Building Safety Fund.
We don't know when the remediation is going to start.
And 4 years on, these problems are still not fixed. The building is still unsafe.
Flat owners from across the country have shared their stories with the BBC. Those trapped in unsafe, unsellable homes say it's taking too long to remove dangerous cladding. The government has set aside billions to remove cladding. Figures analysed by the BBC show that 60% of tower blocks with Grenfell-style ACM cladding have had work fully completed. It's lower for private sector blocks. Less than half have been finished and signed off as safe. For other types of dangerous materials known as non-ACM cladding, progress has been slower. Nearly 1,000 blocks have been approved for funding, but so far just 18 have been completed. That's less than 2%. The government says a series of measures have been taken to make sure that the work is carried out quickly and safely. The Housing Secretary met with developers today to urge them to come up with more money to pay for the work to get done. In Salford, these 9 blocks weren't eligible for government funding. The management company removed the cladding, but problems continue.
They took it off and left us.
And how long has it been like this?
It's been like this 3-4 years.
Inside, residents say their homes are freezing cold and energy bills are soaring.
So as soon as it gets cold and you've got no cladding on to keep the warmth in, you might as well get your money and flush it down the loo. It's warmer in the lobbies outside the landings than it is in here. You can see your breath.
A floor up, I met the Vaughtry family. They've been told it'll be 2024 before the work's finished.
We've got a 4-year-old. It's not fair. None of this is fair on her.
She don't understand. She just wants it to be warm. We average about £120 a week wages.
Yeah.
And we're putting like £40-50 a week of that in the electric. And we're all sat here with jumpers and coats and tracksuits.
The company managing these flats for the council has apologised for delays and says residents are receiving financial help with energy bills. Industry experts, though, warn remediation works are complex.
There aren't enough people and there aren't enough materials to do all this remediation work. And even if there were, the hardening of the insurance market means it's extremely difficult for companies to get insurance to do the work.
Hey, be careful, Baba.
The longer it takes to fix these buildings, the more money drains away from those who can least afford it. Sarah Corker, BBC News in Salford.
Let's take a look at some of the day's other top stories now. And the Catholic Church says the former Pope, Benedict XVI, failed to act over 4 cases of child sex abuse when he was the Archbishop of Munich. It's claimed that then Joseph Ratzinger allowed priests who were criminally convicted of abuse to continue working for him. He denies the claims. A 33-year-old man has been arrested on suspicion of murdering Frida Walker, who was 86 and found dead at her home in Langworth Junction in Derbyshire on Saturday. In the attack, her husband, Kenneth Walker, who's 88, was left with life-threatening injuries. He remains in hospital in a critical condition. BT says it's raising its prices by more than 9% because of a dramatic increase in data usage over the past few years. The rise means that, on average, its customers will pay an extra £3.50 per month from the end of March. BT says data usage on broadband services has gone up by 90% since 2018 and on mobile phones by almost 80% since 2019. A giant coral reef in pristine condition has been discovered off the coast of Tahiti. Coral reefs are among the ocean's most threatened ecosystems, but scientists say this one appears to have avoided damage from pollution and rising sea temperatures because unusually it sits in deep water around 30 meters down. Now, it's one of the largest discovered at that depth, which is known as the ocean's twilight zone, and the United Nations scientists who found it say there may be others waiting to be discovered. Both Britain's tennis Grand Slam winners, Andy Murray and Emma Raducanu, have been knocked out of the Australian Open in the second round. Our sports correspondent Natalie Perks has the details.
A morning treat, two British Grand Slam champions on court at the same time. But both were about to put fans through the ringer. The US Open champion got off to a flyer, breaking opponent Danka Kovinic early. But soon, Emma Raducanu was in trouble with blisters on her racket hand. A set down, and Raducanu's only real weapon now was her backhand. She was smiling, but winning the second set meant playing through the pain.
Ouch.
And in the final set, as her right hand rallied, her backhand faltered, and Kovinic inflicted the final blow.
And she's done it.
There were some people in my team that maybe didn't want me to play, but I wanted to go out there and fight through it. It's quite hard to learn or teach someone like that fight and grittiness to kind of hang in there when things are pretty much all against you. So I'm quite proud of that.
Just 2 days after playing 5 sets with his metal hip, Andy Murray was slow out of the gate against Japan's Taro Daniel, ranked 120th in the world. And 16 unforced errors from the Scot saw Daniel take the first set with a flourish. Murray had never lost a Grand Slam match to a player ranked as low as Daniel. He had plenty of chances, but the Japanese played the match of his life to win in straight sets.
I want to perform well in the big events, and for me tonight is not good enough. You know, making second round of slams is not something I find particularly motivating.
A day to forget then for British tennis. Natalie Perks, BBC News.
That's it. Now on BBC One, time for the news where you are. Have a very good night.